So I'm going to call this hearing to order, and I want to welcome members of the Assembly Transportation Committee and the members of the Assembly Budget Committee Sub 3 on Resources and Transportation. I'd like to acknowledge Chair Richard Bloom being with us this afternoon. Thank you for coming, sir. So this is going to be a big year in transportation, and we're in the throes of a full-on funding crisis. The governor committed in his State of the State speech to address the state's transportation needs, but we've had the Speaker Atkins has propelled the Assembly out in front on the issue by releasing her proposal to raise about $2 billion a year for transportation. A number of other members, myself included, have plans in the mix as well that I expect will evolve to complement the Speaker's approach. Today's hearing isn't so much about possible solutions, but rather the purpose of today's hearing is to provide members of both committees and the public with an opportunity to better understand how transportation in California is funded and why. That funding is structured right now is in shambles. We should get right into the meat of today's hearing, so let's get started. So I'd like to call today we'll call this the basics of transportation funding. James Hacker from the Fiscal and Policy. He's the Fiscal and Policy Analysis of the Legislative Analyst's Office. I have a hard time speaking to you. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. And then we'll leave time for questions. So I'll give it a moment for the handout to finish coming around. Great. So if you turn to the first page of the handout, estimated total transportation funding in California. This pie chart shows that we estimate total funding will be about $28 billion in 2015-16, and the chart highlights the fact that this money is raised at three levels. So first, roughly half of all revenue will come from local entities, largely through local sales taxes, transit fares, development impact fees, and property taxes. Additionally, roughly a quarter of all transportation funding in the state comes from the federal government, mostly through the Surface Transportation Program, known as Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century, or MAP 21. This program is mostly backed by federal excise taxes on fuel, but in recent years, an increasingly large share has been general federal spending. The remaining one quarter comes from the state, from a variety of sources, mostly excise taxes on gasoline, but I'll get into that in more detail shortly. If you turn the page, you'll see that we estimate that of this total $28 billion, roughly 60% or so is our estimate will be spent on local projects at the local level. So that means repair and rehabilitation of local streets and roads, as well as local mass transportation projects. Another third will go to support the state highway system, and the remainder will go to support a variety of state projects, including the state's high-speed rail project. In addition to the funds that I've identified here, it's important to note that the state collects revenues from a number of other sources, including vehicle license fees. These mostly go to support the California Highway Patrol and the Department of Motor Vehicles. So if you turn to the next page, we'll dive into the state revenues in a bit more detail. So this bar chart breaks down the total amount raised by funding source over the last decade and a half or so. And if you look at the chart, you'll see that state transportation revenues have increased since 1999-2000. We estimate they were about $3.5 billion in 99-2000, and we estimate that state transportation revenues will be about $6.6 billion in 2015-16. These revenues predominantly come from three main sources. First, excise taxes on gasoline, which is that large gray bar in the middle. Second, vehicle weight fees, which is the black component at the bottom of the bars. And third, sales and excise taxes on diesel fuel, which are the, I guess, slightly lighter gray, right above the excise taxes on gasoline. Additionally, if you look at the figure, you'll see that cap and trade revenue began to be distributed towards transportation in 2014-15, mostly to support the high-speed rail project, low-carbon transit, and intercity rail, as well as sustainable communities and affordable housing. Under current law, 25% of cap and trade revenues will be continuously appropriated for the high-speed rail project, both this year and going forward. If you'll turn the page, we'll get into some of the detailed components of that revenue. So first, the largest component is gasoline excise taxes. And the state collects two excise taxes on gasoline above the base price and the federal excise tax. First, the state collects an 18-cent per gallon base excise tax on gasoline. And we estimate in 2015-16 that will generate roughly $2.9 billion. Of this, the first 6 cents, or the first third, go to local streets and roads based on formula. Above and beyond this, the further 2/3 are devoted to the state highway account, or SHA. And the SHA funds the administration and maintenance programs at the Department of Transportation, or Caltrans, as well as the State Highway Operations and Protection Program, or SHOP, which is the state's primary highway funding mechanism. If you turn the page, in addition to the base tax, the state collects what's known as a swap excise tax. And this is a variable excise tax, the rate for which is set annually by the State Board of Equalization. The governor's budget estimates that this rate will be 12.5 cents in 2015-16, though the final rate is still under consideration at BOE. The budget estimates that this will generate roughly $1.8 billion in revenue in 2015-16. Of this, $1 billion will go to the state highway account to backfill the loss of weight fees, which go to support transportation debt service through the general fund, which I'll get to a bit later. Of the remainder, 44% again is allocated to local streets and roads. Further 44% is allocated to the State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, and the remaining 12% is allocated to SHOP. So if you turn the page again, we'll get into the diesel taxes. And the state collects 3 taxes on diesel, 2 sales taxes and an excise tax. First, the state collects a base sales tax of 4.75%. In 2015-16, this is estimated to generate about $460 million in revenue. Of this, half is allocated to the State Transit Assistance Program, or the STA, which funds local transit and mass transportation projects. The remainder is used to fund state-supported intercity rail programs as well as other mass transportation projects. In addition to this, the state collects a swap sales tax, which is set in statute at 1.75%. This is estimated to generate about $160 million in revenue in 2015-16, all of which is allocated to the STA. Above these sales taxes, similar to gasoline, the state also collects a variable excise tax on diesel, the rate for which, again, is set annually by the Board of Equalization. The governor's budget assumes that the rate will be 12 cents per gallon in 2015-16, though, again, the BOE is still considering the final rate. This tax is estimated to generate about $418 million in revenue in 2015-16. If you'll turn the page again, we'll get into the last major revenue component, which is weight fees and how they connect with bonds. So first, in addition to the ongoing revenues from fuel taxes that I just talked about, the state has issued general obligation bonds to fund specific transportation projects, the largest and most recent of which was Proposition 1B, which was passed in 2006 and authorized the state to sell $20 billion in transportation-specific bonds. The governor's budget estimates that total debt service costs this year will be about $1.3 billion, and that includes Proposition 1B as well as all other bond funds that are currently outstanding. Now, to pay for this debt service, the state uses vehicle weight fees predominantly, which are fees assessed for the weight of commercial vehicles. These are transferred to the general fund to offset a portion of the debt service costs for transportation-specific bonds. And in 2015-16, the governor's budget uses $1 billion in weight fees for this offset. In addition, the state uses certain other miscellaneous revenues, which we estimate at about $170 million, to further offset the transportation or the debt service related to transportation projects. Lastly, the governor's budget uses about $150 million in general fund spending to pay the remainder of that debt service. So if you'll turn the page one more time. This chart simply shows the proposed expenditure of transportation funds by fund source by department. This is the overview of total transportation spending. And there's a lot of information here, but really the two main points are, first, the increase in local funds under the Department of Transportation, increasing from $1.1 billion to $1.6 billion or so in 2015-16. And that, again, just highlights the increasingly local nature of transportation funding. And two, the increase in spending for the High-Speed Rail Authority. Most of this is in bond spending, or specifically Proposition 1A. As well as if you look below that, you'll see the $250 million in continuously appropriated greenhouse gas reduction fund monies for high-speed rail. So that, in a nutshell, is transportation funding. That concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to take questions.
Mr. Daly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, the local fund category on your last page, page 9,
Yep.
that can't be all the local sales tax. What is that?
That's correct. That's predominantly reimbursements that locals pay
okay.
to Caltrans for work
Gotcha.
that Caltrans performs.
Okay, gotcha. Just wanted to make sure. Okay,
The local funds, the local sales taxes that the state doesn't see, they stay with the local entities.
gotcha. That's why I was confused. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions from members of the committee?
So this doesn't include the sales tax for 3.5 to 4 billion.
So this doesn't include the sales tax that includes about $3.5 to $4 billion a year from the locals?
No, not the local specific ones. No, this only shows the state specific sales tax that filters back through the state accounts.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just noting the difference between the way we bring in revenue from the gasoline tax versus the diesel tax. Is there a historic policy reason why we utilize an excise tax at a fixed amount versus a percentage sales tax on diesel versus gasoline?
Historically, the state did charge a sales tax on gasoline, but if you look at the historical funding chart, that was replaced with an equivalent excise tax in 2010-11. And that was largely to give the state somewhat more certainty in the revenue, as well as some more flexibility in how they used it.
It was fixed as an equivalent dollar amount, although it's pennies per gallon.
Right. So I mentioned the variable swap taxes. For gasoline, it's set, or the BOE sets that rate so as to be revenue neutral vis-a-vis the, I guess, what would be the legacy sales tax. So they estimate what that sales tax would have raised and then set the excise tax to raise an equivalent amount.
At that moment in time.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Linder.
I'm looking at that graph on page 3. The years between 2009, 2010, and 2010 and 2011. What's that jump in the amount of the excise tax related to?
That's the replacement of the sales tax with the equivalent excise tax. That's the fuel tax swap.
Thank you, Mr. Hacker, for that comprehensive report. So we'll move on to gas tax past to present, and Mr. Stephen Keck, the Chief Budget Officer from the California Department of Transportation. No, that's good. No, I wanted to. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Chair and members. My name is Stephen Keck. I am the Chief Budget Officer for the California Department of Transportation. Mr. Hacker did an excellent job of giving a brief overview of transportation funding. I've been involved in this line of work for 15 years, and I think it's just about impossible to relay the complexity and with accuracy of the transportation funding picture. And I've never seen it done in 10 minutes before, and honestly, there's nothing I can add to that. So it was an excellent job. What I've been asked to come here and talk about today is specifically the history of the gas taxes, the gas excise taxes, and to kind of see where we've been and where we're going, and also to present some of the challenges that we see from this particular method of taxation. This slide here, the first in your handout, really talks about some of the same things that Mr. Hacker talked about, detailing the excise taxes on gasoline and diesel. One thing I want to point out to make sure everybody's very clear on, an excise tax is a tax per unit of something sold. In this case, we're talking about a tax per gallon of gasoline or diesel. It's not based on the value traditionally. So in California, we have 3 excise taxes. I won't go over them in detail because I think Mr. Hacker did an excellent job there. But the state price-based excise tax, the one we talk about when we talk about the fuel tax swap, it is still an excise tax. It's based on the number of gallons sold, and then of course it's adjusted annually to mimic, if you would, a sales tax. And I'm given to understand the Board of Equalization will be along afterwards to explain the intricacies of that swap. One thing I do want to point out is the base 18 cents per gallon that we talk about with the state excise tax has been in place in various forms and at various amounts since 1923, and it's really the most flexible fund source that the transportation has. We use it to fund maintenance of our state highway system. We use it to fund the operations of the department. We use it to fund active transportation programs, and we use it to fund rehabilitation of our highway system. It's the only fund source with that type of flexibility. And the price-based tax has some limitations, which I'll get into a little later on. The first gas tax was initiated in 1923. We were one of the very first states to initiate a excise tax on gasoline. At that time, it was 2 cents per gallon. So this is 92 years ago. We had a 2 cent per gallon excise tax. Since 1923, the tax has only been increased 6 times. There's been actions to increase the tax 6 times. The last one occurred in 1990 with the passage of Prop 111 that at that point increased the excise tax from 9 cents to 14. And then there were 4 years after that with a 1-year increment, all caused by Prop 111. So we've been at 18 cents per gallon excise tax. This is the base excise tax since 1994, which is just over 21 years now. Over that time, though, we've seen inflation. And this slide here shows 2 things. The green bars at the bottom of the graph show the nominal excise tax rate for each year since its inception in 1923. And the green line is that same rate adjusted for inflation. I've often heard it said that the 1950s and 60s were the heyday of transportation funding and transportation building. If you look at this chart and you look at the value of the tax during those periods, you see that it was very high. As we move forward, though, we see that drop very precipitously in the early 1970s. This is related to the first oil embargo that quadrupled the price of oil overnight, practically. Oil prices have never been the same, and of course that very directly impacts the cost of building roads and highways. So we see a precipitous drop in the 70s from which we've never recovered, and even since 1994, when the tax was last increased, we've lost about half of the value of that tax, a little more than half of the value of that tax to inflation. So as we look forward, what we think inflation is going to do, we've made a lot of progress as a department over the last 5 to 8 years. We had Proposition 1B to fund quite a bit of transportation projects. We've had the Federal American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 that came forward and brought about $2.6 billion in transportation funding to the state. And during the economic downturn that began in 2008, we saw a tremendous amount of savings on the cost of projects. And we saved about $1.7 billion worth of costs on projects because bids were coming in very low, lots of competition, and we had really what was deflation at the time. So we were able to reinvest quite a bit back into the system. But with the economy back on solid ground, if we look at historically how inflation has impacted the cost of doing business, just a 5-year delay in fixing something or in addressing some sort of backlog can add about 20% to the cost of that backlog. It's just inflation, not even including the wear and tear and continued deterioration of our highway system. So inflation is one thing that we're fighting against, so to speak, with the excise tax. And another thing comes about from the fact that the excise tax is based on consumption of gasoline. So it's in everybody's best interest that we see more and more economically viable cars, electric cars, hybrid cars, cars that get better gas mileage. It's good for the environment. It's good for our pocketbooks. It's very good for greenhouse gas. But it's not so good for funding transportation. Because we tax on the gallons of gasoline sold and used, as cars get better and better gas mileage, the amount of funds that come to transportation drops lower and lower. So this graph is intended to show that. The top bar there is what you might see moving forward with growth in vehicle miles traveled across the state. And if gas mileage of the vehicles never changed, then revenue would grow with that. But because we're seeing more and more fuel-efficient cars into the market, and by 2029, we expect to see cars with 55 miles to the gallon as a government standard, we're going to see significant less revenue over time as cars use less fuel to drive the same or more miles. Mr. Hacker did a very good job of explaining the fuel tax swap and how that relates to the price-based tax, and he also touched on something we call the weight fee swap, which occurred at the same time. So during the weight fee swap, commercial vehicle weight fees that were deposited into the state highway account for maintenance and those type of activities were redirected to pay for debt service on transportation bonds. To backfill that, to hold that program harmless, the first call on that new price-based tax was to backfill these weight fees. And then the rest was split 44% to local agencies, 44% to capacity improving projects, and 12% to rehabilitation of the state highway system. The problem that this presents is illustrated in these twin pie graphs that illustrate how the funding is distributed. So the pie graph on the left is the distribution for the current fiscal year. It's about $2.5 billion of funding, and that's based on the 18-cent price-based excise tax. This $2.5 billion, the first $990 million of it was used to backfill weight fees, and the rest was split 44% to local streets and roads, 44% to capacity improvement projects through the state's transportation improvement program, and $185 million to what we call the SHOP, which is for rehabilitation. In the 15-16 year, the second graph is based on a press release from the Board of Equalization last week that indicated they may be looking at a decrease in this price-based excise tax as low as 10.5 cents per gallon. So the second graph is a theoretical distribution of that price-based excise tax with that lower rate. What it shows is, again, the first call is to backfill the weight fees. It's just over $1 billion. And the remaining is split between these three programs. Because the first call is always that weight fee, all of the change in the total tax collected is concentrated in those three areas: in the local roads, the capacity improving projects, and in the rehabilitation of the state highway system. So because of that, you'll hear probably from the local agencies, I think, a lot of concern about this drop in the excise tax rate. It's the law. It's what needs to be done. But the way that it works, it concentrates all the impact into a very small area. And with that, I'll end my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned on one of the pages in your presentation an area of cost savings after 2008 that because more bids were coming in and they were lower, you were able to do some cost savings. Can you identify any other initiatives or programs that Caltrans has taken on to reduce costs of transportation projects, at least from Caltrans' perspective, what it has done to be either more efficient or in cost containment?
Certainly. So in general, especially in the design and construction engineering side of the house, we've continually worked to improve the efficiency of projects. And in fact, we've been able to deliver Proposition 1B projects and ARA projects with very minimal increase in staffing, which we have since actually been decreasing since 2009. We've decreased the staff in that area by 25% over the last 5 or 6 years. So, through efficiency of design and how we do oversight of projects, we've been able to reduce the number of staff needed for that.
So just to follow up, you've had a 25% reduction in staff in a particular area within Caltrans?
In the capital outlay support area of Caltrans, which is about half of the department, directly responsible for the design and delivery of capital outlay projects.
Any other areas at all that there have been initiatives to look for cost savings?
Yeah, certainly. So we've been involved with the Department of Finance in what they call zero-based budgeting for the entire department. We've already done several programs in the department, and each year we come forward with a budget request for a new program. And this is, again, working in concert with the Department of Finance. So we've done, off the top of my head, we've done our local assistance program. We did part of the capital outlay support program last year. We've done our legal program, came out this year with our BCPs. And we also did our planning program 2 years ago. So we're moving through each of the programs. It's a very large department. We're moving through each program and doing zero-based budgeting as we go along.